One have been a wolf for 247 years, 5 months, and 12 days. The Imperium simply has not told my soul yet. The frost-crusted door of the long hall sealed behind me with a sound like cracking ice, and I knew then that I would never again feel the unarmored bite of Fenris's wind on my bare skin. The elders did not speak my deeds aloud because they did not matter anymore. Victories in tribal raids, the slaying of a kraken in the frozen seas, the blood oath sworn to a jarl who fell to a rival's axe. The honors blurred together in this place because glory and failure are concepts that exist only in the world of men. In that distant realm where warriors still believe in sagas and redemption, here, in the shadow of the Fang, there is only the hunt. The induction chamber smelled of Maudad and wolf pelt, a combination that burned the nostrils and lingered at the back of the throat like the promise of a storm to come. Dozens of us stood in ragged lines that stretched beyond the reach of the flickering torchlights, our furs clinking with bone talismans in a rhythm that sounded almost like the heartbeat of the world spirit. The boy beside me, a thin raider who had been caught stealing from a rival clan's herd, shivered silently as the wolf priests processed us one by one. His fierce sweat fell onto the stone floor and froze instantly, absorbed by rock that had drunk the blood of 10,000 aspirants before him. The wolf priest who catalogued my existence had once been human like me, but now his face was a map of scars and rune tattoos, one eye replaced by a glowing augmetic. That word and clicked as it examined my features. The other eye, still organic, still feral, watched me with something that might have been hunger if such instincts were permitted to survive the ascension process. He pressed cold, gauntleted fingers against my throat, recording my pulse, my temperature, the subtle scent signatures that would identify my corpse when the time came. Aspirant 47,892, he growled in a voice like grinding glaciers. Classification, tribal warrior, subclassification, bloodied killer, estimated survival duration, 3 to 6 months standard. 3 to 6 months. They had calculated my death before I had even faced the trials. The armor they gave me was crude at first. A simple chainmail hauberk marked with the wolf rune, the color of fresh snow stained with blood. It hung heavy on my frame, designed not for comfort, but for the weight of expectation should I falter. The links were rough against my skin, forged from reclaimed iron that still carried the scent of whoever had worn it before me. I tried not to think about whether they had died in it or simply outgrown the need for mortal flesh altogether. My trial began in the wilds of Asserheim, that eternal winterland where even the summers dare not tread. The continent was a vast expanse of ice and rock, 3 kilometers wide in places, but endless in its cruelty, with dark stains on the glaciers that resembled the tracks of gods I would never hunt again. A narrow path through the snow allowed the priests to cast us out, and another path at the horizon permitted them to observe our return if we returned at all. There was no shelter, no source of warmth, only the harsh glare of Fenris's pale sun that never fully set and never truly warmed. The sleeping ledge was a crevice in the rock, no furs, no fire, no covering except the hauberk on my back. The cold seeped through the metal within minutes, settling into my bones like a parasite that fed on weakness and doubt. I learned quickly that rest was not recovery in this place, but merely another form of endurance, a temporary escape from the hunt that left me more famished than before. The first night, I listened to the sounds of Asserheim, the howls that echoed through the valleys. The winds carried voices from distant packs, fragments of snarls and challenges, and mad barks that reverberated through the ice like the whispers of the Allfather's beasts. Someone was screaming in the distance below. a raw sound that went on until it became part of the ambient noise. No more remarkable than the creaking of glaciers or the padding of wolves in the snow. I counted the seconds between the predator patrols, memorizing their rhythm like a saga verse. Every 47 minutes and 12 seconds, the shadow of a great wolf would pass my hiding spot. Pause for exactly 9 seconds while it sniffed the air, then continue into the storm. The beasts were not quite animals anymore, their bodies augmented by the spirit of Fenris that allowed them to stalk longer without rest. Their eyes glowed with the fire of the warp, and their growls carried the undertones of ancient curses. They took pleasure in our terror, but it was a wild pleasure, instinctive and fierce. They did not hate us personally because that would have required them to see us as equals rather than prey to be culled until only the strongest remained. We were the pack's whelps, nothing more. Whelps with an unfortunate tendency towards weakness. The morning brought the first hunger, if the gnawing void in my gut could be called by such a tame name. It tasted of iron and desperation, a carefully honed edge that would keep a Fenrisian body functioning at feral capacity for days or even weeks. I hunted with my hands because no weapons were provided, tearing into the flesh of a snow troll because I did not know when the next kill would come or if it would come at all. Later, I learned that the Canis helix contained more than genetics, subtle mutations to reduce fear, enhancers to sharpen senses, and trace amounts of feral instinct that made the mind more susceptible to the beast within. The first few days of enduring this genetic cocktail left me feeling disconnected from my own thoughts, as if I were watching a stranger stalk through the snow through a veil of frost. The other aspirants were shadows, at first glimpsed through blizzards or heard as disembodied howls in the darkness. The boy in the valley to my left had been there for weeks before me. He had been a fisher in his tribe, accused of cowardice for fleeing a Kroken's maw. His name was Harold, and he snarled constantly to keep the cold at bay, telling me about his kin who had probably forged new sagas without him by now. The trick is to remember the fire in your blood. He would bark through the wind. Hold on to something, anything from before. A raid's glory, a feast's song, the way the aurora danced above your longhorn. The moment you let go of that, you become what they want you to become, a beast without a name. The girl across the Ridge Fenris takes women to for the spirit knows no gender in its fury, howled in her sleep every night for the first month I was there. Her dreams were full of fire and drowning kin, the memories of a long ship that had sunk while she watched from the shore. She had been a shield maiden, charged with desertion because she had spared a foe's life against orders. Her crime was mercy, and her punishment was to relive the consequences of that mercy until she broke or became wolf. The labors began on my 7th day. They woke us with the thunder of storm callers, which meant nothing in a place where storms were eternal, and drove us through valleys that stretched beyond the horizon of our understanding. The trials were not merely survival, but an entire forge of body and soul built around the efficient extraction of weakness from disposable aspirants. My assignment was the hunt pits, a cavern of ice and bone where we tracked components for the chapter's arsenal, furs for cloaks, teeth for talismans, blood for rites. The temperature was maintained at just below the threshold of what human flesh could endure, cold enough to numb us, but not cold enough to kill us quickly. The air was thick with frost crystals and the musk of beasts that burned the lungs and left a taste like copper axes on the tongue. We worked in packs of 10, our movements choreographed by the rhythm of the hunt and the ever-present threat of the wolf priest's staffs. The prey we pursued were simple things at first. Elks for their hides, trolls for their regenerative flesh. But each kill had to meet precise standards, and failure to maintain the pack's pace resulted in immediate culling. The punishments were creative in their savagery. An aspirant whose hands shook too much from frostbite might have those hands bound in iron braces that forced them to hunt in increasingly painful positions. Someone who fell behind the pack would be left exposed to the elements, kept alive by sheer will, even as their body began to shut down from exposure. The priests took careful notes on which trials were most effective at forging strength, treating us as whelps in a grand experiment in Fenrisian endurance. I learned to lose myself in the hunt, to let my mind drift away from my body while my instincts continued their primal movements. This dissociation was survival, a way of preserving some small core of self while the wilds consumed everything else. But it came at a cost. Days blurred together into an endless present tense where past and future became abstract concepts. I began to forget the warmth of a hearth, the taste of roasted meat, the feeling of camaraderie that did not smell of blood and snow. The social dynamics of the aspirants were as complex as they were vicious. Alliances formed and dissolved based on the shifting currents of dominance and desperation. The strongest, usually those with raiding backgrounds or shamanic blood, established themselves as pack leaders who controlled the distribution of kills and the assignment of rest spots. They demanded tribute in the form of shares of meat, protection in hunts, or oaths of loyalty, and their enforcement methods were brutal and immediate. I aligned myself with a group led by a former Jarl's son named Sigurd, a man whose body was a catalogue of scars from a dozen tribal wars. He had been cast out for challenging his father's throne, though he claimed he had been defending honor when his kin branded him a traitor. Sigurd understood the value of pack discipline and the saga's rhythm. And, under his guidance, I learned the unwritten rules that governed the trials of Asheim. Never show weakness, because weakness was blood on the ice and the predators here were always starving. Never claim a kill alone, because lone wolves die first in whatever new horror the priests had devised. Never trust anyone completely, because betrayal was sometimes the only fang that could buy survival. Never give up the fire, because the fire was the only thing that separated the living from the frozen dead. Even if that fire was nothing more than the possibility of dying gloriously instead of shamefully. The priests encouraged conflict between aspirants because warring whelps were easier to forge than unified ones. They would deliberately create situations where we were forced to compete for prey or shelter, then step back and watch us tear each other apart with the detached interest of runcasters observing omens. The victors of these conflicts received small rewards. Extra meat or a moment's rest, but the victories were always temporary, and the costs were always permanent. I killed my first rival on a night I had decided to call the Wolf's Moon, in the timeless hell of our frozen world. His name was Carl, and he had been a scout before his selection, convicted of leading his tribe into an ambush for personal gain. He was small and quick, with the cunning of a man who had spent his life finding ways to steal what belonged to others. He had been poaching from my kills for weeks, taking just enough that I would feel constantly weakened, but not so much that I would notice the theft immediately. When I finally caught him, he laughed and told me I was too human to do anything about it. He was wrong. The fight I gave him was not passionate or angry, but methodical, calculated to inflict maximum damage while avoiding the attention of the priests. I used techniques I had learned watching other aspirants settle their disputes, targeting joints and throats where the evidence of violence would be less visible under the fur. When he stopped moving, I felt nothing except a mild satisfaction that the threat had been neutralized. The priests found his body during the next storm patrol. They recorded his death as natural causes exposure brought on by poor hunting and weakness. No one questioned this diagnosis because questioning would have required rites and investigations that served no useful purpose. Carl disappeared from the aspirant rolls as if he had never existed, and someone else was assigned to his hunting ground within hours. That night, Sigurd nodded to me with something that might have been approval. "You're learning," he growled. "The first kill is always the hardest. After that, it's just another skill, like tracking, or skinning, or any other thing you need to know to get by." He was right. The second death came easier, and the third easier still. By the end of my first month in Asserheim, I had stopped counting. Violence became just another aspect of daily routine, no more remarkable than eating or resting or stalking the production of prey. But the physical violence was only the most visible aspect of how the trials consumed us. The real destruction happened slowly, invisibly, in the gradual erosion of everything that made us Fenrisian. They fed us just enough kills to keep us functional, but never enough to feel sated. They gave us just enough shelter to prevent total collapse, but never enough to feel secure. They provided just enough guidance to prevent mass death, but never enough to eliminate suffering. The psychological warfare was more sophisticated. They would occasionally announce that certain aspirants were being considered for ascension, creating desperate competitions as whelps tried to prove their worth through boulder hunts or voluntary challenges. These announcements were always half-truths. No one left Asserheim except as a space wolf, or as carrion for the crows. The Ascension program was perhaps the cruelest deception of all. Aspirants who volunteered for early implantation were promised that their humanity would be preserved in some form, that they would continue to exist as valued brothers of the chapter, rather than dying as forgotten tribesmen. The reality was the Canis Helix's embrace, a process that left behind only enough will to operate in battle and follow pack commands. The failed ones that patrolled the edges of our trials had once been aspirants like us, their humanity genetically excised and replaced with lupin obedience. I watched kin disappear into the implantation chambers, convinced they were choosing glory over death. Harold, the fisher, who had helped me understand the rules of survival, volunteered after receiving word that his tribe had been wiped out in a rival raid. He could not bear the thought of continuing to exist in a world where his saga served no purpose, and the promise of wolfish peace seemed preferable to human despair. The last time I saw him, he was prowling the ridge outside my hunting ground, his movements precise and repetitive. His eyes had turned yellow with the helix, and his skull bore the ritual scars where his doubts had been carved away. I called his name, but he did not respond. Harold was gone, replaced by a thing that wore his face and carried his memories, but lacked any trace of his soul. The seasons changed on Fenris, though we knew of them only through the subtle variations in storm patterns and prey migrations that filtered down through the valleys. Winter brought eternal night that made the already unbearable hunts nearly lethal. Summer brought a brief thaw that seeped through the ice and settled in our wounds, making every movement painful and every breath a vapor in the frigid air. Years passed, or what felt like years. Time became elastic in the eternal frost of Asserheim, stretching and compressing according to the rhythms of hunger and triumph that structured our existence. I lost track of my own age, forgetting whether I was 15 or 20 or somewhere in between. My hair went grey from the helix's touch, then white, then began to lengthen in clumps from the genetic shifts. My teeth sharpened and several elongated, leaving fangs that made eating more savage and speaking more labored. The girl who howled in her sleep died during my second winter. I heard her final breath through the ridge between our territories. a rattling exhalation that seemed to go on forever before finally stopping. The priests did not remove her body for 2 days, and the smell of frozen decay filled our entire pack grounds with a stench that clung to everything and everyone. When they finally came for her, they were not gentle. I heard her remains being dragged down the valley, a sound like brittle bone being pulled across rough ice. New aspirants arrived constantly, taking the places of those who had died or failed or simply disappeared into the spiritual maze that swallowed the unworthy. They came with the same wide-eyed ferocity I had once felt, asking the same questions about glory and sagas and contact with the Sky Warriors. The older aspirants would look at them with expressions of distant pity, knowing that these newcomers would either adapt or freeze, but that they would never again be the tribesmen they had been before stepping through those frost doors. I tried to help some of them, sharing what I had learned about tracking and the unwritten rules that governed our existence. Most listened politely and then ignored my advice, convinced that their tribal strength was temporary or that their bloodline would somehow protect them from the grinding machinery of Fenrisian cruelty. A few learned quickly enough to survive their first year. Many did not. The gladiatorial combats began during my 3rd year, though the priests called them pack challenges in their rune logs. Aspirants who violated rules or failed to secure prey were selected to fight each other in a makeshift arena carved from a glacier's heart. The fights were not to the death officially, but serious injuries were common and healing was minimal. The priests and elder wolves would watch from elevated ledges, placing wagers on the outcomes and discussing the fighters' techniques with the detached professionalism of Sogatella's judging verses. I was selected for the arena after striking an aspirant who had been taunting a dying kin in the ground next to mine. The aspirant had been describing in graphic detail how the dying 1S tribe had been enslaved to pay his failures. Taking pleasure in each gasp and sob his words produced, when I told him to stop, he turned his attention to me, speculating about what beasts my body might feed once I was too weak to hunt. The blow I struck was instinctive, driven by a rage that had been building for years but had never found an appropriate target. My fist caught him in the throat, crushing his windpipe and sending him to his knees, gasping for air that would not come. He did not die, but he would never hunt normally again. And the scar that replaced his voice became a constant reminder of what defiance could accomplish when properly applied. My opponent in the arena was a massive man named Torvald, a former berserker who had been selected for killing a Jarl's son in an unsanctioned duel. He was everything I was not: taller, stronger, experienced in blood rage, and completely without fear or hesitation. The pack of priests cheered as he entered the arena, their voices echoing off the ice walls like the baying of hungry wolves. The weapons provided were crude but effective: bone clubs, sharpened icicles, broken axes wrapped in sinew for better grip. I chose a fang from a fallen troll, with enough weight to crush bone, but not so heavy that it would slow my movements. Torvald selected a chain of vertebrae, testing its balance with the professional assessment of someone who had spent years learning how to inflict pain efficiently. The fight lasted 23 minutes, though it felt like hours. Torvald was stronger and faster, but I had advantages he did not expect: cunning, the budding helix in my veins, and the accumulated fury of years spent watching good kin destroyed by a world that fed on suffering. I avoided his direct attacks, using the arena's slippery floor to stay mobile, looking for openings created by his confidence and aggression. When the opening came, I took it without hesitation. He overextended during a particularly vicious swing, and I stepped inside his guard, driving the fang into his solar plexus with enough force to rupture internal organs. He folded round the impact, his breath coming in short gasps that sprayed blood onto the ice floor. I hit him again, this time across the base of his skull, and he fell forward into his own blood, twitching once before becoming still. The pack cheered my victory, but their applause felt like condemnation. I had become exactly what they wanted me to become. A killer who performed violence for their approval. A feral thing that had forgotten the difference between survival and savagery. The victories that followed were easier technically, but more difficult emotionally. Each opponent was another aspirant like myself, someone who had been shaped by the same forces and driven to the same desperate measures. I killed them efficiently, without passion or hatred, because efficiency was what the situation required, and because caring too much about the kin I killed would have made survival impossible. Between fights, I hunted the valleys and tried to remember who I had been before becoming a whelp. The memories were fading, becoming abstract and uncertain, like sagas told by drunken scolds about heroes I had never met. Had I really been a raider once, standing at the prow of a longship with brothers who looked at me with respect and loyalty? Had I really lived in a long hall with a hearth where I shared tales and me adored for no reason except that I found joy in kinship? The details blurred together until I could not be certain what was memory and what was hallucination. Perhaps I had never been anything except what I was now, an aspirant, a killer. A thing that existed only to serve as an example of what happened to those who sought the Sky Warrior's mantle. Perhaps my previous life was just a delusion, a comforting lie I had created to make my current existence bearable. Sigurd died during my 4th year, killed not by violence, but by a wound fever that had been growing in his lungs for months. The chemical taints in the air from volcanic vents had finally accumulated to toxic levels, and his body simply stopped being able to process the poison. He faced death with the same steady pragmatism he had brought to everything else, giving me advice about pack leadership and survival until his voice became too weak to carry across the ridge. "Don't let them make you into something you can't howl with," he told me during our last conversation. "I've seen good warriors become beasts in here, and beasts who found ways to stay human. The choice is always yours, even when it doesn't feel like there's a choice at all." His death left a vacuum in the pack's structure that other aspirants immediately moved to fill. The contests for dominance were violent and brief, resolved through ambush and betrayal rather than open challenge. One avoided involvement in these struggles, having learned that visibility was dangerous and that the safest position was often somewhere in the middle of the hierarchy where you were valuable enough to protect but not important enough to challenge. The new leader was a woman named Freya, a former shaman who had been selected for communing with forbidden spirits after refusing orders to curse a rival tribe. She was intelligent, ruthless, and completely committed to survival at any cost. Under her leadership, the aspirant pack became more efficient, but also more brutal, with harsh punishments for any perceived disloyalty or weakness. She approached me after one of my arena victories, studying me with eyes that had seen too much and forgotten how to show mercy. "You fight well," she said, "but you fight like someone who still thinks he's going to leave this place human. That's going to get you turned eventually." She was right, though I did not want to admit it at the time. Some part of me was still holding on to the possibility of ascension, release, or a glorious saga, and that hope was making me careless. The most dangerous aspirants were those who had accepted their fate completely, who had stopped thinking about the future and focused entirely on the immediate requirements of the hunt. The escape attempt came during my 5th year, organized by a group of desperate aspirants who had managed to steal rune maps of Asahaimes layout from a careless priest. They invited me to join them, recognizing my combat skills and relatively good physical condition as assets that could improve their chances of success. The plan was complex but achievable. Create a distraction during a storm. Overpower a patrol beast, and use hidden tunnels to reach the lower valleys before the priests could raise the alarm. I agreed to participate, though I knew the attempt was doomed. Not because the plan was flawed, but because escape was never really about leaving us. The real prison was what we had become during our years of trials, the accumulated damage to our bodies and spirits that could not be left behind simply by running through a different blizzard. We were planning to take our chains with us wherever we went. The attempt failed exactly as I had expected, though not for the reasons I had anticipated. The priests had known about the plan from the beginning, having been informed by one of the conspirators who had been promised better prey in exchange for cooperation. The informant was a man named Eric, a former hunter who had been slowly dying from frostbite and wanted to improve his chances of living long enough to see another thaw. The priests allowed the escape attempt to proceed until we had committed ourselves completely, then triggered avalanches and sealed the tunnels we were using for our route. The pursuit that followed was not urgent or desperate, but methodical. Like wolves tracking down wounded prey that had gotten into the pack's territory. They used howls to flush us out of hiding places, fangs to disable anyone who resisted, and casual violence to discourage future rebellions. Of the 8 aspirants who participated in the attempt, 3 were killed immediately. 2 were selected for early helix testing, and the remaining 3 were returned to the trials with enhanced restrictions and monitoring. I was among the survivors, though I was not certain whether that represented good or bad fortune. The enhanced restrictions meant solitary hunting for months, reduced prey shares, and elimination from pack assignments that might provide opportunities for further planning. Solitary hunting was a different kind of death, slower but more thorough than the quick violence of the arena. The territory was smaller than my regular grounds, barely large enough to stalk without circling back on my own tracks. No light except what filtered through the eternal storm. No human contact except the occasional distant howl. No sounds except my own breathing and heartbeat and the gradual dissolution of my sanity. I talked to myself constantly, carrying on conversations with kin from my past, who existed now only in increasingly unreliable memories. I told sagas to the winds, recited runes I half remembered from tribal shamans, and howled songs whose words had been eroded by time and cold until only the melodies remained. The boundary between internal growl and external howl disappeared, and I found myself responding to voices that existed only in my head, as if they were real packmates crouching beside me in the snow. The hallucinations began after the 2nd month. Visual distortions that resolved into wolf faces when I was not looking at them directly. Movements in the peripheral vision that suggested the presence of beasts that were not there. Shadows that seemed to have depth and substance even in the absolute whiteout of the storm. I knew these perceptions were not real, but knowledge did not make them less vivid or less disturbing. When they finally returned me to the pack, I discovered that the trials had changed in ways that went beyond normal attrition and replacement. New rites had been implemented, new punishments devised, new forms of degradation introduced for the entertainment of the priests and elders. The pack challenges had been expanded into a full tournament system with brackets and championships and wager pools that involved wolves from throughout the Fang. The prey had gotten scarcer, the hunts more dangerous, the healing more perfunctory. Aspirants were dying at an accelerated rate, their bodies unable to cope with the increased demands and reduced support. The priests seemed to have concluded that the trials were becoming too lenient and had decided to resolve the problem by culling the aspirants to death as quickly as possible. I had been selected as a featured competitor in the championship tournament, my reputation as an arena fighter having grown during my absence. The other aspirants looked at me with expressions I could not interpret: fear, respect, envy, and something else that might have been pity. They knew, as I was beginning to understand, that being good at violence in this place was not an advantage, but a curse that would eventually consume everything else I might have been. The tournament was structured as a series of elimination bouts, with the winners advancing to face increasingly dangerous opponents until only one fighter remained. The prizes for victory were meaningless: extra prey, improved hunting grounds, and the promise of accelerated ascension that everyone knew would never be honored. The real purpose was forging, a gladiatorial spectacle that allowed the priests to wager on outcomes while watching aspirants destroy each other for their amusement. My first opponent was a young man named Lars, barely 16 years old, and selected for evading a tribal levy during a beast migration. He had been in the trials for less than a year, and his body still showed signs of the life he had lived before his call: soft hands, unscarred skin. He moved like someone who had never learned to fight properly, relying on desperation and adrenaline rather than technique and experience. I killed him quickly, efficiently, and without pleasure. The pack cheered, but their voices sounded distant and unimportant, like background noise from another valley. I had crossed some invisible line during my months in solitary, and the emotional responses that had once made violence difficult were no longer accessible to me. I felt nothing when he died, except a mild satisfaction that the problem had been resolved. The subsequent matches followed the same pattern, opponent after opponent, each one desperate and frightened, and ultimately insufficient to the task of survival. I dispatched them with increasing mechanical precision, my movements becoming more efficient as I eliminated anything that was not essential to winning. The crowds grew larger and more enthusiastic as word spread throughout Asserheim about the tournament's progress. The final match was against Freya, the shaman who had taken over Sigurd's position as pack leader. She was older, more experienced, and completely ruthless in her approach to both leadership and combat. More importantly, she had nothing left to lose, having long ago abandoned any hope of survival or glory in favor of simple endurance. One of us walks away, she told me as we prepared for the fight. The other becomes food for the crows. But either way, we're both already wolves. We died the day we stepped into Asserheim. Everything since then has just been the body learning to catch up. She was right, and that knowledge liberated me from the last constraints of conscience and humanity. I fought her with everything I had learned during my years in the trials, using every technique of violence and deception that had allowed me to survive when better kin had died. The match lasted longer than any of the others, both of us too experienced to make the obvious mistakes that would have ended the fight quickly. When I finally killed her, it was through treachery rather than superior skill. I feigned a wound that caused her to lower her guard for just long enough to position myself for a killing blow. The strike caught her in the temple, crushing the bone and driving fragments into her brain. She fell without a sound, her face showing no surprise or accusation, only the distant expression of someone who had been expecting this moment for a very long time. The pack erupted in celebration, their cheers echoing off the ice walls like the screaming of the damned. I stood over Freya's body, covered in her blood and my own, feeling absolutely nothing. The tournament was over. The championship was mine, and none of it mattered because we were all already beasts and had been from the beginning. They returned me to my hunting ground that night with promises of rewards and ascension that I knew were lies. The tournament had served its purpose, providing entertainment for the priests and demonstrating to the other aspirants what happened to those who became too skilled at violence. I would continue to fight when called upon, continue to kill whoever they placed in front of me, until I became too feral or too damaged to be useful, and was quietly culled. The years that followed blurred together into an indistinguishable mass of routine hunts and grinding savagery. I fought in the arena when summoned, stalked the valleys when assigned, and existed in my territory during the hours between obligations. The other aspirants avoided me now, recognizing that I had become something different from what I had been. Something more dangerous, but also more broken. New aspirants continued to arrive, taking the places of those who had died or been ascended or simply disappeared into the spiritual machinery that processed Fenrisian suffering with glacial efficiency. I watched them go through the same stages of adaptation or destruction that I had experienced. But I felt no connection to their struggles and offered no assistance or advice. Their survival or death was irrelevant to me because survival itself had become irrelevant. The dreams, when they came, were not of freedom or revenge or glory, but of simple non-existence. I dreamed of dissolving into the ice of Asaheim, becoming part of the frost and rock that contained us all. I dreamed of forgetting my own name, my own history, my own face, in whatever reflection the frozen pools might show. I dreamed of peace, the kind that comes only when the hunt finally stops, and the burden of the beast is lifted from shoulders that have carried it too long. But the hunt persisted, stubborn and unwelcome, dragging me through each day and into each night with mechanical regularity. My body continued to function despite the accumulated damage from years of poor nutrition, exposure, and frequent violence. My mind continued to process sensory input and form memories, even though the experiences being recorded were too similar to previous experiences to be worth remembering. I measured time now, not in days or months, but in kills. The kills of rivals in the arena, the kills of prey from disease or violence or simple exhaustion, the kills of parts of myself that had once seemed essential but had proven to be expendable when the trials demanded it. Each kill was a mark on an invisible Sega scroll that tracked my journey from tribesman to something else, something that wore human shape but had forgotten human purpose. The priests occasionally visited my territory, studying me with the clinical interest of shamans observing a successful rite. They asked questions about my experiences, my observations about the trials, my recommendations for improving the efficiency of the culling process. I answered honestly because honesty required less effort than deception, and because truth and lies had lost their distinction in a place where neither mattered. "You've adapted remarkably well," one of them told me during a particularly lengthy interrogation. "Most aspirants either break completely or maintain enough resistance to be problematic. You've found the optimal balance between ferocity and obedience." I asked him what that meant, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "It means you've become exactly what the system was designed to produce," he said. "A warrior who has been stripped of everything that makes resistance possible while retaining enough instinct to serve useful functions. You're a template for the future of the VCA Fenriker." He was proud of what they had accomplished, proud of the transformation they had worked upon my flesh and soul. I was their masterpiece, proof that any Fenrisian consciousness could be broken down and rebuilt according to chapter needs if the process was applied with sufficient patience and expertise. The man I had been before my selection was completely gone, replaced by something that looked like him but shared none of his essential characteristics. That night, I lay in my crevice and tried to remember what I had looked like before becoming an aspirant. The face that appeared in my memory was generic, unremarkable, possibly imaginary. I could not recall the color of my eyes before they yellowed, the shape of my nose before it broadened, the way my mouth had moved when I laughed. The person who had worn that face was a stranger to me now, someone whose motivations and desires were as foreign as those of an alien Xenos. The final revelation came during my 6th year in Asserheim, though the exact timing might have been different because time had lost most of its meaning by then. A new wolf priest arrived to oversee the trials. A young runecaster with a kind of fresh zeal that suggested he had not yet learned to see aspirants as anything other than tribesmen who had earned a chance. He instituted reforms, better prey allocations, improved healing rites, training sessions designed to prepare aspirants for eventual ascension. The changes were modest but noticeable, and for the first time in years I felt something that might have been hope stirring in the depths of my consciousness. Perhaps ascension was possible after all. Perhaps the tribesman I had been before my selection was not completely dead, but merely dormant, waiting for the right conditions to emerge from whatever dark corner of my mind still remembered how to be human. The new priest, whose name was Runemaster Einar, requested individual meetings with long-term aspirants to assess their ascension potential. When my turn came, I found myself standing before him in a small chamber that had been decorated with wolf pelts and saga scrolls of worlds where battles still raged under alien suns. The normality of the setting was disorienting after years of ice and rock, and I had difficulty focusing on his questions because I kept staring at a rune of a space wolf in power armor Children of Fenris playing in the snow somewhere far from this place. "You've been here longer than almost anyone else," he said, consulting a data slate that contained the accumulated documentation of my half-decade in the wilds. 6 years, 2 months, 8 days. That's an unusual length of trial for someone with your original classification. Trial, he called it trial, as if my suffering had been a form of initiation rather than punishment. I wondered if he truly believed that, or if he was simply using language that made his duty more palatable. "What would you like to do if you ascended?" he asked, his voice carrying a sincerity that seemed genuine but felt dangerous. Hope was a luxury I could not afford, a weakness that would make the hunt more difficult if his reforms proved temporary. I told him the truth, that I could not remember wanting anything beyond the basic requirements of continued existence. Prey, shelter, the absence of immediate pain or threat. The dreams and ambitions that had once motivated my actions were as foreign to me now as the desires of someone from another tribe. He made notes in my file, his expression showing concern that might have been professional or personal. "The Fenrisian capacity for adaptation is remarkable," he said, "but it's not irreversible. With proper support and gradual integration, even severe spiritual damage can be addressed." I wanted to tell him that he was wrong, that some transformations could not be undone once they had reached completion. The tribesman he was trying to forge no longer existed except as a collection of instincts and reflexes that had been repurposed to serve the needs of survival. But I said nothing because hope was precious to him, and destroying it would have served no useful purpose. The training programs he implemented were voluntary, taught by ascended brothers who had managed to retain enough of their former knowledge to serve as instructors. I attended sessions in basic tactics and rune lore, not because I needed the skills, but because the routine provided structure that made the passage of time more bearable. The other students were mostly younger aspirants who had arrived recently enough to still believe in the possibility of eventual ascension. The instructor for my tactics class was a former grey hunter named Bjorn, a scarred veteran with gentle eyes who had been wounded in a Xenos raid. He taught with quiet patience, never showing frustration when students struggled with concepts that had once been simple for them. His crime had been none. He was here to forge us. Fighting is remembering how to be a wolf, he told us during one lesson, his voice barely above a growl. Every tactic you master is a piece of yourself that the wilds hasn't managed to destroy yet. He was killed 4 weeks later during a hunt gone wrong, struck in the head by a trolls club while protecting a weak aspirant. The training programs continued under new instructors, but something essential had been lost with Bjorn's death. The replacement teachers taught the mechanics of combat without understanding its deeper significance, turning training into just another form of hunt rather than a pathway back to humanity. Runemaster Einar lasted 9 months before being reassigned to duties that better matched his temperament and experience. The official reason given was doctrinal constraints that required a more traditional approach. But everyone understood the real explanation. Compassion was expensive, and the chapter had limited resources to waste on the rehabilitation of aspirants who might never ascend. His replacement was Wolflord Gunnar, a former Ongfang who had earned his reputation culling weak packs during the Great Hunt. He arrived with a mandate to reduce leniency while maintaining ascension rates, and his methods reflected the straightforward brutality of someone who viewed aspirants as potential brothers or dead weight rather than kin who had made mistakes. The reforms instituted by Einar were reversed within days of Gunnar's arrival. Prey rations returned to subsistence levels. Healing became purely emergency-focused, and the training programs were eliminated entirely in favor of expanded hunts. The pack tournaments were reinstated and expanded, with increased frequency and more elaborate prize structures designed to encourage maximum aspirant participation. Ascension is a luxury we cannot afford for the weak, Gunnar announced during his first address to the aspirant population. Your purpose here is not to become better men, but to serve the Allfather through ferocious labor until your trials are completed or your usefulness expires. Those who accept this reality will find their remaining time here more tolerable than those who persist in unrealistic expectations. The return to the old system was swift and comprehensive. But something had changed during the brief period of reform that could not be entirely undone. Some aspirants had remembered what it felt like to be treated as potential brothers rather than prey, and that memory created a form of resistance that was more dangerous than any physical rebellion. They began to organize quietly, sharing kills and knowledge in ways that suggested the possibility of coordinated action. I was approached by several groups seeking to recruit me for various schemes. Some focused on escape, and others on sabotage or protest. My reputation as an arena fighter made me valuable to anyone planning violent resistance, while my long tenure gave me insights into trial operations that could be useful for more subtle forms of opposition. I declined all invitations, recognizing that organized resistance would only provide the priests with excuses for harsher measures. The crackdown began for months after Gunnar's arrival, triggered by the discovery of a poaching network that had been moving extra prey between territories. The investigation that followed was thorough and brutal, involving interrogations, searches, and punishments that were designed to extract information while discouraging future conspiracies. Aspirants were turned against each other through promises of improved grounds or threats of enhanced culling, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and betrayal that made any form of cooperation dangerous. I was questioned repeatedly about my knowledge of resistance activities, my relationships with other aspirants, and my willingness to serve as an informant in exchange for ascension. The interrogations were conducted by specialist priests who understood the psychology of long-term aspirants and knew which pressures would be most effective at breaking down whatever remained of our pack solidarity. "You're a survivor," the lead interrogator told me during our final session. "You've lasted 6 years by adapting to changing conditions and avoiding unnecessary risks. Cooperation with our investigation would be consistent with that pattern of intelligent self-preservation." He was offering me a choice between collaboration and continued resistance, though both options led ultimately to the same destination. Collaborators were useful only as long as they provided valuable information, after which they became liabilities to be disposed of quietly. Resistors were simply disposed of more quickly and with less ceremony. I chose a third option: complete withdrawal from any activities that might be interpreted as either cooperation or resistance. I attended no gatherings, joined no conversations that might be construed as planning, and avoided any associations that could be seen as suspicious. I hunted when assigned, fought when summoned, and existed in my territory during all other hours, like a beast that had been leashed between hunts. This strategy of strategic invisibility proved effective at avoiding official attention. But it came at the cost of complete isolation from whatever remained of the aspirant pack. Other aspirants began to avoid me, uncertain whether I had become an informant or simply lost my mind entirely. I became a ghost within Asserheim, present but not participating, alive but not really living. The resistance network was eventually destroyed through a combination of investigation and betrayal. Its members either culled or transferred to harsher grounds with even deadlier beasts. The priests celebrated their victory with renewed restrictions on aspirant movement and communication, implementing surveillance measures that made any form of unauthorized association nearly impossible. Wolf Lord Gunnar summoned me to his chamber after the last of the conspirators had been dealt with, studying me with the calculating expression of a man who was trying to solve a puzzle that did not quite fit his usual categories of understanding. 27 aspirants were involved in resistance activities, he said, reading from a rune slate on his desk. 27 individuals who chose to risk everything for the illusion of freedom or dignity or whatever concept they thought was worth dying for. You were not among them, despite having both the skills and the relationships that would have made you a valuable recruit. He paused, waiting for me to explain my absence from the conspiracy, but I had nothing to say that would satisfy his curiosity without creating new problems for myself. Intelligence suggests you're either the smartest aspirant in this batch or the most broken, he continued. Either way, you represent a useful data point for understanding long-term adaptation to the trials. You'll be transferred to the Ascension Wing for extended observation and implantation. The Ascension Wing was located in the deepest halls of the Fang, accessible only through rune wards that required multiple forms of authorization. The aspirants housed there were subjects in ongoing rites designed to improve the efficiency of transformation, punishment, and control techniques. Some were volunteers who had been promised better conditions in exchange for participation. Others were simply selected based on characteristics that made them suitable for particular protocols. My new accommodations were an improvement over standard territories: larger space, better lighting from glow globes, temperature control, and even a small viewport that showed a view of the stormy peaks where beasts and thunderhawks operated around the clock. The improvements were not gestures of kindness, but practical necessities for maintaining subjects in optimal condition over extended periods. The implantation began immediately. conducted by teams of iron priests who measured everything from reaction times and sensory acuity to stress responses and pain tolerance. They were mapping the changes that 6 years of trials had worked upon my mind and body, documenting the transformation from tribesman to protovolf with scientific precision. The physical examinations revealed the accumulated damage of a half-decade spent in volcanic air, eating raw prey, and enduring frequent violence. My lungs showed scarring from ash pollutants. My bones had gained density from constant strain, and my nervous system displayed the kind of hypervigilance patterns typically found in battle-hardened brothers. I was a catalogue of Fenrisian injuries, a living record of what prolonged exposure to trial environments could accomplish. The psychological evaluations were more complex, involving tests designed to measure loyalty, pack bonding, moral reasoning, and emotional responsiveness. The priests seemed particularly interested in my capacity for violence and the psychological mechanisms that allowed me to kill other aspirants without apparent emotional distress. They administered scenarios and simulations that required me to make choices between self-preservation and the welfare of the pack, carefully recording my responses and the reasoning behind them. "Fascinating," one of the priests muttered while reviewing my test results. "Complete erosion of conventional tribal constraints, but not through madness or disloyalty. The inhibitions have simply been replaced by more practical considerations. Hunt-focused ethics rather than socially focused ethics." They were studying me like a specimen, documenting the successful transformation of a Fenrisian into something more useful for chapter purposes. I had become proof that their methods worked. Evidence that any individual could be broken down and reconstructed according to pack needs if the process was applied with sufficient patience and expertise. The other research subjects were at various stages of the transformation I had completed. Some were recent arrivals who still retained enough of their original personalities to resist the implantation protocols. Others were further along the continuum, displaying the kind of mechanical compliance that indicated successful genetic adaptation. A few had progressed beyond even my level of modification, becoming essentially biological beasts that responded to stimuli without any trace of independent thought or feeling. Iron Priest Helgar, the lead overseer for my case, explained the purpose of their work during one of our regular interview sessions. He was a broad man with prematurely white hair, and the kind of intense focus that suggested a personal investment in his rights that went beyond professional obligation. The traditional model of trials assumes that suffering and deprivation will motivate behavioral change, he said, reviewing notes from my latest round of testing. But suffering is inefficient, requiring constant monitoring and enforcement. What we're redeveloping here is a more elegant solution. Subjects who internalize chapter goals so completely that external control becomes unnecessary. He was describing the creation of perfect space wolves, individuals who had been genetically modified to serve pack purposes without requiring surveillance or coercion. The research conducted here would be applied to recruitment across the chapter, creating a generation of brothers who police themselves and each other according to the Great Wolf's preferences. "You represent our most successful case study," he continued. 6 years of systematic conditioning have produced an individual who functions optimally within trial parameters while retaining enough cognitive capacity to perform complex tasks. You're a template for the future of the Space Wolves. I asked him what would happen when the research was completed and my usefulness as a test subject expired. "That depends on the results of our final evaluations," he said. "Subjects who demonstrate stable adaptation may be transferred to full implantation where their skills can be utilized productively. Others may be selected for advanced modification procedures that will enhance their chapter value. Advanced modification meant Wolfen conversion, the genetic overload of personality and independence in favor of bestial obedience. I was being offered a choice between brotherhood and devolution, though both options represented forms of death that differed only in their efficiency and finality. The research continued for months, each day bringing new tests and evaluations designed to probe the depths of my transformation. They measured my responses to moral dilemmas, pack situations, and stress scenarios with the thoroughness of Skold's mapping unexplored sagas. Every aspect of my psychology was documented, categorized, and analyzed for insights that could be applied to future subjects. The final phase of testing involved exposure to experimental conditioning techniques designed to enhance the modifications already achieved through conventional trials. Chemical treatments that altered neurotransmitter function, surgical procedures that implanted organs, and behavioral therapies that reinforced chapter loyalty through reward and punishment systems more sophisticated than anything used in the wilds. I submitted to these procedures without resistance, because resistance would have been both futile and counterproductive. The priests noted my compliance in their reports, describing it as evidence of successful adaptation rather than simple resignation. They could not conceive of a form of surrender so complete that it appeared indistinguishable from cooperation. The treatments produced measurable changes in my brain chemistry and cognitive function, fine-tuning the transformation that had been occurring gradually over the previous 6 years. My capacity for independent thought became more limited, my emotional responses more predictable, my behavioral patterns more consistent with chapter expectations. I was becoming a more perfect version of what the trial system had been trying to create from the beginning. Iron Priest Helga seemed pleased with the results, though he maintained the professional detachment appropriate for someone studying pack animals rather than human beings. During our final interview, he expressed satisfaction with the research outcomes and optimism about the broader applications of their work. The techniques we've developed here will revolutionize recruitment practice throughout the chapter, he said, reviewing the comprehensive documentation of my case. Instead of culling aspirants until they die or become too feral to maintain, we'll be producing loyal brothers who can contribute productively to the Imperium's wars. He asked if I had any questions about the research or my role in it, as if my curiosity about my own destruction were a relevant consideration in his calculations. I asked him whether he thought the tribesmen who had entered Asserheim 6 years ago would recognize the thing I had become. Probably not, he said, after considering the question. But that tribesman was a mortal who threatened pack stability through human frailty. The individual standing before me now is a loyal wolf who understands his proper role in the hunt. The transformation represents an improvement by any reasonable standard. He was right from his perspective. The man who had been selected for glory had been replaced by something more useful and less troublesome. The process had been efficient, thorough, and completely successful in achieving its intended goals. I was a testament to the effectiveness of Fenrisian forging, proof that ascension was possible if one defined ascension as the complete erasure of undesirable characteristics. The notification of my ascension came 4 days later, delivered by priests who treated me with the mechanical courtesy reserved for valuable equipment being moved between halls. I was being reassigned to a Bloodclaw pack, where my skills and conditioning would be utilized for chapter supply chains. No, for the wars of the Imperium. The Thunderhawk was filled with other graduates of various trial programs. Individuals who had been modified in different ways but shared the common characteristic of complete pack compliance. We sat in silence during the journey, each of us lost in whatever remained of our individual consciousness, no longer capable of the kind of communication that might have provided comfort or companionship. The chapter's wars were endless, a landscape that had been stripped of everything except its capacity to produce enemies for distant populations. The battlefields were exhausted from generations of intensive warfare. The air contaminated with promethium, and the ground carried the dusty smell of a galaxy that had forgotten how to sustain life without constant artificial intervention. The packs were scattered across the stars, each one focused on a different aspect of enemy destruction: Xenos extermination, heretic purge, demon banishment. The warriors were a mixture of bloodclaws, grey hunters, and long fangs, all of them modified in various ways to maximize their ferocity and minimize their maintenance requirements. I was assigned to Pack 9, a unit that specialized in the close-quarters slaughter of traitors in vast hive cities that stretched beyond the horizon. The work was repetitive and exhausting, involving the maintenance of complex assault patterns that kept the enemy populations cold while extracting the loyalty that would eventually become fodder for Imperial armies on more fortunate worlds. The other brothers were mostly silent, their personalities erased or suppressed to the point where conversation was neither possible nor necessary. We fought according to schedules programmed into implants that regulated our sleep cycles, ammunition intake, and combat output with mechanical precision. The pack leaders were few in number because extensive supervision was unnecessary. When the brothers had been conditioned to police themselves, days blurred into centuries, centuries into sagas as we performed our assigned functions with the reliability of biological machinery. I maintained the assault lines, harvested the enemy, and processed the victories according to protocols that had been burned into my memory through repetition and reinforcement. The work was my existence, and existence was the work, a perfect closed loop that required no external motivation or reward. Sometimes, in the brief moments between battles and rearming, I would remember fragments of dreams that seemed to come from someone else's life. Images of sunlight falling through long-hole roofs onto wooden floors, the sound of kin laughing, the taste of majad that had been brewed with care rather than engineered for efficiency. These memories felt like messages from a ghost, communications from someone who had died so long ago that even his name had been forgotten. But the dreams always faded, dissolved by the harsh light of bolter fire and the immediate requirements of another day's war. The person who had experienced those moments of joy and connection was as distant from my current reality as the Allfather himself, a figure from legend whose existence could be acknowledged but not meaningfully comprehended. The years passed, marked only by the subtle changes in my aging body and the gradual deterioration of the armor I maintained. My hair became completely white. My hands developed the tremor that came from decades of exposure to warp taint. And my vision began to fail in ways that made detailed combat increasingly difficult. I was becoming obsolete, a piece of biological machinery that was wearing out and would eventually need to be replaced. The end came not dramatically, but with bureaucratic efficiency. A medical evaluation determined that my combat efficiency had declined below acceptable thresholds, and the cost of maintaining me in fighting condition exceeded the value of my continued service. I was scheduled for dreadnought internment, a process that would be quick, painful, and economically optimal for the chapter's operational requirements. They gave me 3 days to complete my final assaults, ensuring that the transition to my replacement would be smooth and that no ferocity would be lost during the changeover. I spent those days performing the same tasks I had performed for centuries, maintaining the same lines, following the same protocols, as if nothing had changed except the arbitrary deadline that now defined the limits of my existence. On the final day, I was escorted to a sarcophagus facility where other obsolete brothers waited for their turn at internment. We sat in rows like weapons on a rack, each of us tagged with identification runes and processing codes that would ensure accurate record-keeping during our entombment. The chamber was quiet, except for the soft humming of machinery and the occasional shuffle of feet as someone was called forward for processing. When my rune was announced, I stood and walked to the designated station without hesitation or fear. The tech priest, who would perform the procedure, was efficient and professional, checking my identification tags and verifying the internment authorization before preparing the blades that would sever my limbs. He worked with the casual competence of someone who had performed this task hundreds of times before. "Any final saga for the record?" he asked, more from habit than genuine interest in my response. I told him that I had been a wolf for 247 years, 5 months, and 12 days, and that I was grateful they were finally allowing my body to catch up with the rest of me. He noted my response in his log slate and began the internment. The surgical cocktail entered my bloodstream and began shutting down my vital systems with the same efficiency that had characterized every other aspect of my time in the Chapter S service. My vision dimmed, my breathing became shallow, and my consciousness began to fade like a fire being slowly extinguished. In those final moments, as my brain ceased its futile attempts to process sensory information, I experienced something that might have been peace. The constant vigilance that had defined my existence for over 2 centuries finally relaxed. The endless calculation of battle strategies became irrelevant, and the crushing weight of Lupin compliance lifted from shoulders that would soon be armored forever. The last thought that crossed my dying mind was not regret or anger or fear, but a simple observation that the chapter had achieved its goal with perfect efficiency. The tribesman who had once believed in sagas and fought for kin was completely gone, replaced by something that had served the Imperium's interests faithfully until its usefulness expired. The system had worked exactly as designed, transforming a mortal into a resource, and then disposing of that resource when it was no longer needed. My internment was recorded in the chapter's operational logs as routine maintenance, no more significant than the replacement of a worn-out bolter or the disposal of contaminated ammo. The body that had housed 247 years of suffering was processed through the chapter's sarcophagus systems, its constituent parts eventually becoming fuel for the dreadnoughts, where other modified brothers would continue the endless cycle of war and destruction. Service in the Space Wolves is not honor but transformation, not glory but consumption. It takes Fenrisian warriors and converts them into something more useful and less troublesome, grinding away everything that makes life meaningful until only function remains. The process is efficient, cost-effective, and completely successful in achieving its intended goals. There is no redemption in this system because redemption implies the possibility of return to a previous state, and the modifications inflicted upon brothers are irreversible by design. There is no justice because justice requires the consideration of right and wrong, and institutional efficiency recognizes no moral categories beyond productive and counterproductive. There is no hope because hope depends on the belief that conditions might improve, and the only change brothers can expect is the gradual decay that leads from ferocity to dreadnought. The wolf priests, the lords, the iron priests who operate these rites are not monsters, though they perform monstrous tasks. They are servants of a chapter that has calculated the most efficient methods for converting human potential into lupine resources. and they execute their duties with the same professional competence that characterizes all space marine bureaucracy. Evil in this context is not a matter of individual malice, but institutional logic carried to its inevitable conclusion. Those who enter the Space Wolves leave behind everything that made them human except the basic biological functions that can be harnessed for endless war. Their minds are stripped of independence, their bodies modified for optimal performance, and their spirits crushed so completely that the concept of resistance becomes literally unthinkable. They become perfect wolves, completely compliant, totally predictable, and utterly disposable. This is the reality of service in the Velka Fenrika, a chapter that has abandoned the pretense of heroism in favor of simple resource extraction. Brothers are raw material to be processed, not tribesmen to be elevated, and their fate is determined not by the nature of their deeds, but by the efficiency requirements of chapter operation. The man I had been before my selection would not recognize the thing I became, and perhaps that represents a form of mercy. The complete erasure of identity eliminates the suffering that would come from remembering what was lost. The perfect space wolf feels no grief for his destroyed humanity because he has forgotten that humanity ever existed. In the end, Space Wolf justice achieves its goals with absolute efficiency. The elimination of threats to imperial stability through the complete transformation of mortal individuals into useful resources. The process is brutal but thorough, cost-effective but comprehensive, and it serves the chapter's needs perfectly while destroying everything that might have made those needs questionable. This is what being a space wolf means in the 41st millennium. Not a place of sagas or brotherhood, but a forge that takes fierce people and forges them more thoroughly until they become exactly what the Imperium needs them to be. And when they are no longer useful, even in their forged state, they are entombed with the same efficiency that characterized their transformation. There is no escape from this system, because it does not simply confine the body, but reconstructs the soul. There is no resistance, because resistance requires a sense of self that the process systematically destroys. There is no hope, because hope depends on possibilities that the system is designed to eliminate. The only truth left at the end is the truth I discovered in my final moments, that death, when it finally comes, represents not defeat but completion. The chapter achieves its perfect victory not when brothers are killed, but when they become so thoroughly modified that killing them is unnecessary. My internment was simply the final step in a process that had been completed years earlier, the disposal of waste that had served its purpose.